So welcome everyone who is attending this program today in person and on live stream. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to mention that our next speaker program is on February 7th, Tuesday, February 7th, and it's virtual only. Professor Jia Bingbing of Tsinghua University, who's one of China's leading international law scholars, is going to be discussing future of the United Nations together with the faculty director, Jose Alba. So it should be a really terrific and very timely conversation. So today we're discussing, can Europe and China resume business as usual? And this also turned out to be very timely because very recently China has reopened its borders, fully reopened, fairly fully reopened for the first time since the pandemic. Our guest speaker is Sabine Stricker-Kellerwood. And he's an international lawyer who has been 30 years of experience advising clients on business in China. He was the first European lawyer to open an office in China in 1985. She's frequently active as an arbitrator with various Asian arbitration institutions or related arbitration institutions. He's an advisory board member of the Mercator Institute for China Studies, which is a leading German think tank, and is a founding member of the German-Chinese Dialogue Forum. I can't think of anyone better placed to help us come up to speed in the relationship between China and Europe. And so I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone online. I can't see you online, which is really a pity, but I hope you're putting in as many questions as possible so that we have another 90 minutes of communication. Catherine picked the topic, actually. Can EU-China resume business as usual? So she was visionary 2 months ago, or whenever we set it up, just pre-Christmas time. And just 2 weeks ago, the China Daily, the Chinese newspaper, had huge front page articles, China to remain crucial market for local firms. So China's Daily started it off that, we might have business as usual. And Vice Premier Liu He, just 3 days ago in Davos at the World Economic Forum, he assured foreign investors that life is back to normal. That's the way the New York Times quoted it. Life is back to normal. So is that true, or can that be true? Will it be true? I mean, with normal, he probably means pre-pandemic times. Are we catching up with the pre-pandemic times, which would basically be a continuity assumption? And is that continuity, if you cut out the pandemic times, is the continuity assumption justified? I wanted to say concluding, but now I've put it first because I like the idea. If you are a pessimist, it's probably true. If you are an optimist, it's not true. That sounds a bit contradictory. And then we pick up that one at the end of a few minutes and you let me know. So China changed. It's not us who changed. We did not change our view on China. It was China that changed first. Over the last few years, China changed, especially for the foreign businesses. And I'm talking here less politics and more on the business side. China became less predictable and we have less planning certainty. China remained the same when it concerns the US market and the innovation hub. But otherwise it changed. The Communist Party has the final say, and foreign investors just don't know how compliance and governance should be handled when the Communist Party has the final say. That's different from 10 years ago. Ideology trumps economy is a quote. It's a quote from the latest annual paper that comes out every year from the EU Chamber of Commerce in China. The head of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China, Mr. Wutke, he phrased it, ideology trumps economy. That's something he would have never believed in 5 years ago. So that's what the perception is for the foreign investors. So now that we see that change, do we want to change China? Do we want to change China? That might probably be a difference between the US and the EU. We don't want to change. We just want to make sure that we react and adapt to the way China is when it comes to our values, interests, and business dealings. So that is what's changed, and that was real change. And it also concerns the rule of law, the many things where we just don't know how a Western lawyer or a European lawyer should look at when, as a sanction, a WeChat account is just deleted so that the company or the individual cannot engage in regular businesses. Or on the international level, when the space garbage is not communicated. Chinese put out space garbage and they don't communicate. And as a result, Spanish aviation authorities had to stop some aviation for some time. So that was against the international practice. It doesn't even have to be only against international norms. So how do we react to that change? In the past, we had the German phrase, which said Handel durch Handel, change through business or change through trade. And it's a common perception that that's probably not going any further. We don't want to say that it was wrong. We don't want to say that trade brought us closer together. I don't mean by changing somebody in my way and getting him my way, but changing him in a way of how we internationally do the business. So the European perception is change through trade was either a mistake, or at least, I think Jerry Cohen would put it, it was not a mistake, but at least it wouldn't continue anymore. We didn't do it wrong for the last years. So the political view in Europe, there is one consensus. We have many disconsensus, as you know, and many discords. But there is one consensus, is that China is phrased now as being a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. That's the trinity. That's the European trinity on China: a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. And there's some parliamentarians in the EU says you cannot pick and choose. You cannot say one day, oh, today China is a partner, tomorrow it's a competitor and a systemic rival. You have to find yourself in which area, now talking again as a business person, in which business segment, in which project, in which industry China is more a partner or can be a partner when I do a project. Where is it a competitor with fair or unfair competition mode? Or where is it a systemic rival, like state-sponsored, state-planned, state-guided business activities? Are we doing fine on the IT?
No, I just heard.
Yeah.
It's just a phone or something.
Okay, you get no information that we are
Yeah,
can't be seen and can't be heard. Okay.
you could be heard. Yeah, I checked.
Okay,
You're
that's
heard
good. That
well.
gives you
Yeah.
some briefs,
Yeah.
repeat again the important thing, a competitor and systemic rival. What is, and then we have the trinity. And the other discussion where we are probably having a slightly different thought from the US is that we firmly say that the aim is not, it's not to become. That's what we say repeatedly. And it's kind of a consensus, which I think makes it quite different from the US planning ahead how to deal with China. But we have another D. We don't have decoupling, but we have another D, and the D is de-risking. And that's what the EU president, Mrs. von der Leyen, just said last week. She said, we're not talking about decoupling, we're about de-risking. And now coming only to the business. When it comes to business, it's another D again, it's the dependencies. It's how to deal with the dependencies on China. In the old days, dependencies was something really good because it means we were all interconnected. And the fun thing about globalization is that the more we got interconnected, the more complicated business dealings were, the better it went. So if you look at a car has 1,000 parts. I mean, I pick up the 1,000, I have no slightest idea, A car has maybe 1,000 parts, and they come from probably 100 countries. Did we ever complain about that? No, it was a benefit. It was the benefit of interdependencies and the benefit of dependencies which seem to be profitable to everybody. So now we talk about dependencies on China. And that we have to do something about the dependencies of China, which are increasing the risks of the companies. And I think the topic was pushed further. It was not came up, but it was pushed further because of the Russian war against Ukraine. When we saw the dependencies we had on Russia. And those dependencies are, on the one hand, purely import, like on pharmaceuticals in China, that we're so dependent on our antibiotics and pharmaceuticals from China. But the other dependencies which are discussed in Europe are the dependencies when it comes to investment. Are European companies so dependent on China that it increases their risk of survival when something happens in China. That's the key question. And we understand that the answer for many is decoupling is the only answer. You have to withdraw from China and invest in the US, if we still can do. I mean, you are not doing the best to help us. Or the other way would be that, what else can we do? What else can we do to reduce dependencies? That's the big question European businesses are having right now. Again, it depends on the sector, it depends on the business, it depends on the size, but there are a couple of rules that go along. The one is we talk about diversification, not a D, right? We always deal with Ds. So diversification is the one. And that's why all the European politicians travel to Southeast Asia, travel to Asia and other countries, just to see what can we do. I support that, but as we all say, there's only one China. And how many Vietnams do I need to make up for the business in one province of China? So that's not the one solution, you know. And but it's on the agenda in the boardroom. At least the minimum in the boardroom is if we are so dependent on China in our businesses, then at least we should try what other sources we have. And I guess your country's effort in this is a good example, which is actually a very great step. Because it also described recently in the last few days the nature of the dependencies. The nature of the dependencies was that it was in today's news that Apple pre-pandemic booked 50 flights a day for technicians and personnel between the West Coast and China. 50 flights a day. And dependency were not technology by I give you my know-how here, give it back to me or keep it, right? No, the dependencies were the interaction among the technicians, which were the foundation of the innovation. So how do you undo those dependencies? You know, that's a big question. But just to describe to you that diversification is not by taking the factory in Shanghai and moving it to Vietnam. It's much more. What companies in the boardroom do? They look at their China operations as a hub for China. It's the China only. When foreign companies enter the Chinese market, first it was also for China, only for China. The first Volkswagen cars that were manufactured in China, that was of course for the Chinese market. That was not meant to be for export. And then slowly it grew for the international base and for exports as well. And now the companies are rethinking to have a hub, to have an entity in China that is isolated from geopolitical troubles, which is not so dependent anymore from the supply chain with other countries and for the customer base with other countries. Which also, you said in one email you wrote to me, why are investments going up? Investments are going up and went up the last few days, European investments in China the last 2 years, because the companies wanted to make their entities in China more resilient, to be independent from foreign financing, independent from foreign workers, employees, or technicians, and independent from supply chain and sales chain. So there was a jump in investment. So that's the other strategic option, is to further invest in China for your entity to make it resilient. And when the geopolitical troubles come, that somehow they are not caught in the middle of all these sanctions. And that was one aspect, you know, when I talked about the different risks in China now. I mean, you know, if you're a lawyer, you could be the chief sanction officers in a company. And I remember a friend of mine asked me 5 years ago whether he should do sanctions in the big conglomerate he was working for. And he said, oh, this is totally unsexy. And I said, wait 2 years, you know, chief sanction officer would be great stuff. You know, I still don't know whether it's great, but at least that's one of the areas where I said, you know, so making China your hub, making China your entity, also data-wise, because you have no free flow of data between China and the rest of the world. So that is one. The exit option, comparing Europe with the US, is rarely looked at among European companies. I will phrase it, it's like in the pandemic times, and I also believe going forward it's the same. Probably less new projects, but no exit. Far less new projects, but fewer exits. So that's about what is discussed about the dependencies. And one more sentence. When the media or whoever discusses China says, oh, all these companies, they want to do more and more money in China. They will not exit, they will not decouple. Why are they doing that? Do they have no moral interest? Do they don't have no values? Do they have nothing? We have to distinguish between the various kind of companies. There is a wonderful statistics from Rhodium Group from New York, who said that over the last 4 years, 80% of the investment into China, 80% came from European investment into China. 80% of European investment in China came from 10 major companies, among which 4 Germans, 1 chemical, 3 automobile. So if you look at 80 and 20, then you see what are the other 20 doing? You know, did they already exit China? No, they just have a more resilient structure with less new investment, looking at the existing investment, how they can improve their investment, and looking at the famous family-owned businesses, which are my favorite. Some of them really have a long-term strategy, unlike the listed companies who already 10 years ago, 20 years ago, always set up the China operation in a way that is one of many, and that it's not the one they rely upon. And the final word, because for the introduction is far too much, when you look at dependencies, the key question politics has to answer is, when are dependencies of European companies in China so strong that if we have geopolitical troubles, their existence is at risk? I don't think the problem is whether, you know, they make more money or less money, but whether their existence is at risk, whether the foreign investment financing the European governments put out is at risk for those companies, or whether they even have a risk of not surviving back home because 80% is their China market already. So that's what politics has to deal with. Politics has to deal with de-risking, as Mrs. von der Leyen said, you know, making sure that the companies who are totally free to decide what to do are not overexposed to constitute a systemic risk back home. And that's why we have a very difficult situation now, how to deal with this situation. And Germany is trying to put up a China strategy paper, the German government, because we promised that after the election. And it's very, very difficult to align the interests, and we can talk more about it. So that was too much in 15 minutes, too many topics. And Catherine was worried that she might not have enough questions, or that you might not have enough questions. And I tried to squeeze in as much as I could so that at least every one of you has one question. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Sabine. That was fantastic. I have about 40 questions. Debating which is the top one, but I'll stick with.
Shall I choose?
I'll stick with what I in mind at the beginning, which was, when's the last time you were in China and when are you going back?
Actually, I hated the first part of the question for the last 3 years, because it felt it was always undermining credibility for all the China advisors and all the China think tankers when they have been asked, when have you last been to China? So do you still have any idea what's going on? And we all, you know, so the answer is always defensive. And my business is telling clients that I, know everything. So I tried for 3 years to get out of this defensive mode and find a proper answer, which I couldn't. So I was last there in December 2019, like everybody is my answer, like everybody. And so the focus is more on how do we deal with China from what we understand China is and wants to be. Is not to focus out, I want to know exactly, what China thinks and does, but it's more, how does it affect us and how do we have to prepare to react? So that's what we all tried since December 2019 to turn it around. When I'm next time in China, it's, as you said, I'm sitting as arbitrator in a few cases. So there was one case that did not allow virtual hearings. So I have to go back for the hearing, which I'm looking very much forward to. But on the timing, I would say, let's wait for April, May. I think, which is probably the difficult time now that we thought that after the pandemic, things would calm down and go back to usual, at least on the travel side. But I think
But
we should still,
flights are still not there.
yeah, flights are still not there and visas are still not there. Yeah.
Are you hearing a lot of sort of pent up demand?
Yes, I think
the business.
Yeah, I think the business community just has to see what's going
They
on.
want to get on the plane. and look.
And you cannot run a company, not even running a company, you cannot understand the company, which is run by local management remotely. I mean, it just doesn't work. They are all eager to go and see it and talk to everybody as we all are, right? So there is a big run up. I don't really think it's the rush for new projects. I think the dust has to settle. It's the rush for consolidating, de-risking, and as I said, making your projects resilient and see what was happening. Also during the last 2 years, a lot of management functions were localized. Lots of foreigners who went back home did not return. So that isn't an easy thing to do. We know all the advantages and disadvantages of localizing your management. So if you did localize your management during the pandemic, I mean, there's a lot of work you have to do now, to see whether things are aligned or not. So I expect a rush, but not statistically for new projects.
So it seems to me, because against the backdrop of the political churn, whereas you say in Germany, there's still debate over the strategy paper. And there's still these intra-EU tensions, France, Germany not on the same page and so on about the approach to China. And then businesses not really knowing what they don't know about their own operations and having to rethink whether the pandemic accommodations they made last change. The dust is going to be in the air for months to come.
Oh yeah. I mean, being a China manager is not getting more fun, right? Or it's getting more fun the way you put it,
Right.
because you also have the old risks plus the new risks. I mean, the old China risks didn't disappear. The old China risk like market access, technology transfer, IP protection, public procurement,
Right.
level playing field on the ground. I mean, whatever we have books written for 40 years on all these traditional China risks, they did not go away. And then we have the add-ons, which are far, far less accommodating to the lawyers. I mean, market access, we know, we look at the law and how to interpret it, and the technology protection, we can do all this. But how we do this on, as I said before, on having Communist Party body in your corporation, or lobbying for standard setting, make sure that the standards that were used for many times, will continue to be used. That's not a legal issue. It's like a participation in standard setting. Data protection, that's something lawyers hated for years, except if I look at the younger lawyers in the room, I know they love it, but they are not yet the general counsel. So general counsels hate data stuff. Right? They have to learn that. Sanctions, as I said, And then all the uncertainties of political and geopolitical interference into the project. I mean, that's really tough. And so that's why I think it can't go back to business as usual, because it's just the package they are carrying so much heavier.
So another piece that would represent, I think, returning to business as usual is if the comprehensive agreement on investment.
If
If that happened, we would know we were back to.
No, but that's such a useless thing. We don't really have to push for that. I mean,
Okay.
the comprehensive agreement on investment, Port Kai, between the EU and China. I never was a strong supporter because I felt it had nothing new in there, or so to speak, very, very little. On market access, the Kai was negotiated for, if I'm not mistaken, 7 years. So when they put up the list with what they want from China, 7 years before they finalized it, there were things on the list that had become redundant 7 years later. Market access. China had opened up in those various fields of sector specifications in those 7 years, so that was already a useless part, I felt. Right. And it had no dispute resolution mechanism, which we lawyers really hate if that's not in there. Right. And there were many other things. So the Kai was a political paper. It wasn't really something a lawyer loved to look into. Because. So having said that, the Kai was put on the deep freezer after the EU imposed sanctions on some Chinese individuals because of Xinjiang events. And then it went on the total freezer from the Chinese side as well. And the Chinese came with counter sanctions on some EU officials and some think tanks, EU think tanks. So now I read this morning that I forgot who it was, and Chinese politician said, oh no, it was the Chinese ambassador to the EU, the new one, who said that if the sanctions were lifted on both sides, things would be business as usual. That's what he said. Sanctions lifted on both sides. That somehow doesn't make sense. Because our European sanctions, there was a reason for the sanctions. I would say if you lift the reason for the sanctions, then we can lift the sanctions and you can lift the counter sanctions. But to cut off one of the elements, and just say, you know, if the two sides lift the sanctions, we are back to square one. I think we don't need the Kai. Whether we ever want to play with it again is a different thing. That's a totally political issue. But for the business community and for the legal community, it's not really that relevant.
Okay, so business is not pushing this.
No, business doesn't care.
Chris Schultz keeps bringing it up.
No, I think we don't really bring it up very often.
Okay. So what is the big, if business, if German and European business could, you know, submit a wish list to Lioha, maybe they did at Davos, what would head that list for them? Would it be removing the Communist Party groups from?
Really a question. I didn't really think about it for a while, whether a wish list would still make sense. But of course, we have to have wish lists in life to go on, right? As I said, we still have the old wish lists. We can just pull out of the drawer and use again. But what do we do with these uncertainties? So my wish list would be to re-establish predictability and planning certainty for businesses. If you purely look at business and not geopolitics, but then of course, Lioha would right away ask me, well, how do you do this? What is the sub-wish list for your wish item, predictability and planning certainty? And a lot is about rule of law. I think you only have planning certainty and predictability if you really can push as much as you can to have an, I don't want to use the word independent, but to have a proper judiciary. And but as I said before, it's quite tough to say what I cannot tell China do something about the corporate governance and the Communist Party. This is their system, it's their structure, and they have chosen that the Communist Party should be stronger than it was in the 90s and in the 2000s. So this is not on my wish list. And that's why I said we are more dealing with a reaction. How do we deal with the circumstances that such is the case?
Well, what are the kinds of situations, what are the real life scenarios that are following from having this increased party role in the operations of companies? We keep hearing about the party role, but we haven't seen so much.
We haven't seen so much for a couple of reasons, is because there wouldn't be too many companies go out and said we had this in this case and the Communist Party was nice to us. I mean, I think I would probably not be the first to do that.
You would advise them not to, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just, you don't have to go out in public. Your question comes exactly to that point with the wish list. If it's systemic difference I have in the market environment, which I find in some countries and others, and with the systemic differences are mostly a lack of transparency. It's hard to have a wish list for transparency. And that's exactly that. If I would know exactly what the Communist Party is supposed to do, it's the same like national security. We don't really have to stick to Communist Party issues at the moment. It's the same with national security. If every law we have in China is subject to national security concerns, if even the law on data transfer in China, it has a wonderful decision-making tree. The cybersecurity law, data protection law has the decision-making tree, which says, if it's a national security concern, please go left. And we say no, we go right. On the next corner, it says, if it's national security, turn right. There is never a definition of which level of national security is meant and what's the difference is between corner 1, corner 2, corner 22. And that's an issue with lack of transparency. So, and that's why it's so tough to put it on the wish list. And that's why we can do a little wish list, but probably it's more what do I do back home to deal with those risks?
And this, to be clear, this was not the case pre-Xi Jinping, is what you seem to be suggesting. This is
I'm
just a
suggesting
bit-
that we cannot work on the assumption of continuity. You know, we worked on the continuity assumption with China from the 80s to probably 2010. Because China opened up more and more. China reformed its institutions, its legal institutions. The law were quite clear, much easier to read, at least
But
for
there
us.
was, but there were
So
always incidents of extra legal
Yeah.
actions.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm talking about these continuity assumptions. We had the trust and the confidence that things go sort of in one direction and going into the area of reliability and predictability. Of course, not 100%. That's not what I mean, but I mean, we start from the 80s. And I think from 2010 onwards, we have much more a different way of rule making. We find many more vague vocabularies. We find not the legal language anymore we used to be in all the documents. So that's why I say that that's the difference, right? What is happening online,
So we'll
ladies and
start
gentlemen,
taking
dear
some
students?
questions. So I see lots of hands in the room, so we'll take a few in the room and then we'll go to some online questions as well. So I'll give the first one to our faculty director, Professor Alvarez.
So I just wanted to follow up on Catherine's last question. So it sounds like what you're saying that what changed in 2010 is not just judges. That is, judges now taking orders more clearly from the Communist Party, changing the interpretation of existing law. But you're also suggesting that either the laws changed or the regulations under them changed by being more ambiguous. So am I understanding that properly? Because I was trying to figure out how a lawyer would see this ideology trumping economy, not by particular examples of this company being destroyed, but by what actually happened in the legal system. And I've heard that judges are now taking more orders, and that leads to less predictable interpretations of the law. But you're also suggesting that the law itself or the regs changed. Can you say a bit more about
I
that?
think when I read some recently published laws or regs, I find that the language is not as clear as I had expected it in my continuity section. But I think it's also on the implementation stage that officials used to just have much more power to decide what's good for their district, what's good for the company, and take their own decisions. And I think over the last few years, the readiness to take your own decisions on the implementation level when you're running a project, that has been clouded by ideology and politics. And that's what the paper was to say, that on the implementation stage of the project as well, that government officials are not ready to, comparably to 20 years earlier, to form an opinion, but rather have to take ideology into consideration quite far. So it's sort of on all levels, if you can see that.
Speak to an arbitrator. Do you think commercial arbitration conducted in China involving, say, a commercial entity and perhaps a foreign investor, is that going to be the same?
I hope not. I hope not. I'm just a strong fan of China arbitration, and I haven't seen any.
You haven't seen any change.
And so I think that's a very strong professional community, and I'm hopeful that community.
So that can stay isolated, you think? Interesting.
And then.
Can you respond to the allegation that you might be naive and perhaps inconsistent in your presentation, saying that the lead up to ideology Trump's economy has led to the US and Europe not wanting to change? Isn't the idea that Chinese de-emphasis of the market economy and emphasis more on equality within China causes a change in the US economy and hurts the US economy, and that the US wants to change those parts of China that are not consistent with the US liberal economy.
I like that you bring up the word naive, because that's sort of the thread going through the discussions on China in Europe for many years. And I remember sitting at the think tank a few years ago where my wonderful French colleague said, "Oh, you Germans, you're so naive on China." I kind of felt totally insulted. But I took it to the heart, right? And even now, you often hear exactly that in the China discussions. We are naive. And one of the items of naivety is what I mentioned before. It's that Handel and Durchwandel, change through trade, was not a viable concept from the beginning, and that we were naive in believing that. Or that we were naive in believing that foreign companies can strive and really make big money in China without any repercussion coming later. So many things where we have been told we are naive. But naive to the extent that we are naive if we don't want to change China. So likely, do I take it correctly that that's somehow in there?
Yes.
We were just a small country, you know, we're poor Europeans. We don't really want to take that job up. And no, I think every country has to choose his own system, and we can do as much as we can where we encounter violations of global values, but not for the rest, right? And of course, if that's the way China wants to do it and wants to dominate its business-wise or ideology-wise, all we have to do is see whether back home we have our values and our interests, and that could be naive. I'm right, and especially if you're a small country and say, you know, I want to hold up my values. But I'm also, in a way, saying, you know, then we have to distinguish again what are my values and what are global values. Like on human rights, I'm not ready to say that these are Western values. You know, it's global values. So. But maybe you're right. If you're a small country and want to fight uphill, then you are naive. And if you're not seeing that dangers coming around the corner where you're still trying to be both partner competitor before you're a systemic rival, that might be naive too. But I'm not there. But I understand.
But you're not saying the United States is a small country.
No, I meant Germany. No. Oh, exclusively talking about Germany. Yes, but my perspective, you know, my perspective of these things, why I'm not ready to call myself naive. Although I'm sure I am.
Drafted was I think 3 years ago. And I think it's kind of interesting that you said China is now even more unpredictable than it was before, given that everybody talked about this like 3 years ago. Oh, a new era of investment liberalization is starting, the market's becoming more predictable and transparent for foreign investors, and kind of looking at the law maybe similarly to Kai as maybe more a political paper than really something that changes or improves the market environment for foreign investors. Kind of all the market entry liberalizations that have already been in place before the law, just manifested in the law, but also the national security review that's coming additionally, and the anti-sanction measures. Do you think the foreign investment law, ironically, is even more detrimental to foreign investors than before the foreign investment law? Or?
Actually, I never took the foreign investment law as a milestone in any way. I found the more foreign investment law was a consolidation of existing legal regulations. It was a necessity, because we had these different laws on joint ventures and on wholly foreign owned, and they were really super old, you know, like me, and from the 80s. And so I never took it as a real milestone. I think it was more kind of nice to say that it was a milestone, but it didn't change anything in substance. It basically consolidated what was there again. And then in addition, you had, as you said, the market openings, which are not in the foreign investment law, but are in the negative list and catalogs what I'm allowed to do or not. And there, China opened a few areas where they had already promised to open them a long time ago. So also that was quite linear. So the foreign investment law was not a game changer. It was not a huge jump. It just consolidated what was there already. And in a way, the Kai didn't do much either, or much more either. And I think the foreign investment law technically was necessary. That's why I don't say it was a political element only. The foreign investment law was something we needed. We like to have that consolidation. So it was a technical legislative act, whereas the Kai is a political. And more than ever, the Kai is a political document now. Whether it will ever be ratified or not will be a totally political question. No lawyer will ever get involved again in the Kai, or there are so many outdated things in there. And you also mentioned the national security law and
The review and the anti-sanction.
the anti-sanctions and all that. Yeah, these are a mixture of politics and law. That's clear. I mean, the more vague terms you have in those laws, the more it becomes a political animal. And the more it looks like a legal provision, the more you can bet on it. But it has, if I read it innocently, it has just so many vague terms where we don't know what to do with it. So that it's more a bureaucratic hurdle plus political uncertainty facing the foreign companies.
Jess, can you tell me if we have some questions online?
We have one anonymous question.
Okay, why
Um,
don't you read it loudly?
Is it allowed?
yeah, so the question is it true that 40% of Mercedes sales are now in China? If so, can Mercedes afford to be concerned about Xinjiang and similar issues?
I understood. Okay. I was just wondering whether the others heard the question. They did? Yeah,
I
okay.
believe so.
Should have, yes.
Probably the answer is yes, it's true. I really don't know the numbers, but that seems comparable to other numbers we see. It's the numbers of especially German car making companies in China on the sales side. We don't have any numbers on the profit side. So that makes a huge difference. The dependency on China does not so much depend on sales numbers, but the financial dependency and the survival dependency, as I put it, depends on the profits. And it leads to the question whether dependency can be so strong that it does not allow you to criticize China. And the answer is that's the big question. That's exactly what we want. That's exactly what we call dependencies, and where we have to work around with the dependencies. It's not only the financial dependency, it's also the dependency affecting major values, right? And each company has to deal with that. And we have companies, Mercedes and Daimler, they don't have any presence in Xinjiang. So it's more on the abstract level, whether they can still do business in China despite China's activities. And we have other companies which have presence in Xinjiang, which have their own operations in Xinjiang, both chemical and automobile. And here they have quite a significant pressure on what to do with those operations. The pressure is high, definitely higher than it was years ago, or than it was at the time when they entered the projects. But it's not that we have a solution. Bringing me back to solutions, we have no regulatory provisions controlling foreign investment, Germany, except when it's dual use and military and some others. But whether I do a project in China, in Turkey, in South Africa, or in the United States, we have no monitoring in Germany, neither monitoring nor approval requirement. And so to start that discussion is in a super infant stage. We are in an infant stage of whether German companies should get the obligation to report on wherever they invest, or certain countries, less so whether they need approval. I just want to make that sure, because that's different from the discussion going on here, that we just don't have that. Our DNA is still free flow of investment, right? And so when we look at the tools, how the German government wants to deal with German industries depending heavily on China, the tools are quite limited too, because we don't have those control mechanisms. We have a kind of investment financing, investment guarantee. So they're presently discussing whether they should have a cap for investment guarantees they are giving to German companies investing in China or not, and they refused recently one additional investment guarantee for one German company in China, which is big there already. So that's on the tool side. The tool side is not that the government can do that much when it comes to foreign investment. And so in the case you mentioned, or any other case of a company engaging in China and to what level it is critical of China or not, it depends a lot on the pressure building up within the company or from outside.
To what extent do the US sanctions against different Chinese entities, and particularly this most recent CHIPS law, to what extent are they having an impact on German entities? We know there's a Dutch chip maker that is directly in the.
I think every single boardroom has this section on, sanctions, where they see how the matrix of sanctions goes and what the US companies, the US sanctions do to their companies, depending on how much business they have in the US themselves or not. I'm not an expert on the chip side, how it directly affects or indirectly affects Germany, but that's clear. That's part of this. When I said I want to be the chief sanction officer, that's part of it, because it's not China sanctions, it's just everybody's sanctions and how the matrix goes.
Yes. Well,
And again, as I mentioned before, also one of the areas of diversification is also how to get the China operation out of the potential of third-party sanctions affecting that operation.
meaning to make it not a German company anymore.
Or to make it not a, I mean, of course, technically you always have the ultimate owner. But, if a German company has a company in China and at the same time has one in the US at the critical industry, then discussions are going on whether the German entity could be moved, whether the Chinese entity could be moved into another structure to make it less infectious or infected by the US sanctions. But personally, I think you always have the ultimate owner, and the ultimate owner is the German company. But that's exactly the point where the discussions are also going on.
Thank you. I have a question about European companies owned by China, as we have seen for Chinese companies acquired a lot of European companies. And you mentioned change in the Chinese government over the past years. Do you also see a change in the governance of these companies, like European companies owned by China?
Yeah. In the governance, you said?
Yeah, in the governance or
I was just like, when you started your question, I was on a different track on how to control Chinese investment in Europe. I should always wait until the question is finished. I'm sorry. So, no, I don't have much. I have anecdotal stories only when Chinese-owned companies, how they run their business, but that's not valid for any assumption on how they are run. I really don't know, because I also have no Chinese clients. I'm sort of totally focused on Europeans going into China and not the other way around. So I have no inside knowledge on how these companies are run. I was rather thinking about what we did not address yet. Business as usual would be that we welcome foreign investment with no limitations. In the case of the harbor incoming, in the case of the harbor in Hamburg, I don't know whether you saw the case where Germany had to approve whether Costco can take a share in the Hamburg harbor. There was a huge discussion in Germany, and that kicked it off. We didn't have much of a discussion there before. We had one a few years ago when the Roberts company KUKA was bought by the Chinese. But that discussion didn't hold on. But in this case, it was the Chancellor himself who had to veto or not veto the acquisition. And that's why when it became quite a big case.
This was back in early October.
Yeah,
right.
And only another year. Yeah.
In the end, my recollection is he split the baby and approved a smaller.
He didn't split the baby. Whoever came up with the idea of making the baby smaller, in a way, it wasn't split. Luckily, the baby wasn't split. No, it was reducing the shareholding from 30 something to 24.9. Right. That was the answer. I don't really know whether that solved the problem, but
there's currently no review of the incoming.
There is a review. Yes, we do have. That's what I said. We changed over the years, over the last few years. We have a review depending on sectors and percentages, and we have no review for greenfield projects. or for financing of startups. So that we don't have, but for buying companies, Chinese companies buying German companies, every country has its own rules. So here it's only the German aspect.
And does German business oppose setting up those reviews? Logically, you might assume they would oppose both the incoming and the outgoing reviews, or would that actually,
I mean, they would
take some pressure off
Oh,
them?
no, they would definitely oppose outcoming reviews because we just never had that before. I never thought of it before. And they're already worried about monitoring because supply chain monitoring is already a big issue. So the companies are really worried that they're already burdened with a lot of monitoring and reporting. So on the incoming side, I don't really know how German companies would generally react to a stronger control of Chinese companies coming to Europe or to Germany in that case. I really don't know whether we have a consensus. I really don't know because of the interdependencies we have, that many German companies have strong relationships with Chinese companies and they don't really want the business be tainted too much by more regulatory work. But on the other hand, if it's unfair competition, you know, in the cases of Chinese competition come into Europe, which is not according to our market standards, then of course, I believe we have a strong opposition. And the Hamburg Harbor was exactly that question. Is it fair competition? Is it unfair competition? Is it state sponsored? Is it free market economy? Is it not? Is there a geopolitical master plan? Is there not? So there were all those many criteria came together in the Hamburg Harbor case, which none of these questions you could answer definitively, yes or no. Professor Alvarez.
So yeah, in the United States, it's the CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which, as I understand it, is still focused on national security. Now, national security is broad, but it is not based on unfair competition, right? So the screening of Chinese investment still has to be excused on the basis of the threat to national security, broadly construed. But you're describing Germany's screening as encompassing.
No, Professor Alvarez, thank you for pointing that out because my language was just, I was talking so fast that I didn't make the break. I should have made, no, I didn't mean unfair competition in the commercial sense. I meant in the sense of systemic rivalry and different systems playing according to different rules. So, for example, if I have a state-sponsored company which does not have to follow market-oriented profit and loss criteria because it's state-sponsored and the state says you go in there, you do this project, and that what I would qualify in the non-legal term as an unfair competition to a German one. The criteria we have are also national security and critical infrastructure.
Right,
In the most sense. Yeah.
that's what
So
the
we have-
US says.
yeah.
And you're saying that's German specific, it's not EU specific.
It's not EU, no, we are still have, every country is in the framework, set its own rules on, yeah, we still have countries who very welcome foreign investment and even give green cards for foreign investment, which is quite difficult for us, other countries to understand. I think, yes.
I have my general question. I'm a Chinese, but even I'm Chinese, sometimes for most of the time, I was confused, if not frustrated, by what now the government they are saying and what they are actually doing. It's like you mentioned the Davos Forum this year, and the New said, well, some people say China will go for the planned economy, and that's by no means possible. But
Sorry, he said some discussing that.
he said, well, some people say China will go for the planned economy.
Mhm.
That's by no means possible, the quote end. But the sarcasm is, the Davos Forum is meant for the entrepreneurs, but this year, for the first time ever, no Chinese entrepreneurs show up. Because in your previous years, such as the Jack Ma, he might show up, but this year he is marginalized in China. So do you think it's the Chinese government that just pay lip service and what they actually do and what they are saying go opposite way? It's like you also mentioned the party groups in the companies, and from the news, I know that they are actually continuously sending the first secretary of party to the private firms and companies and the corporations. And it seems that they are the party wants to perpetuate it, not to end it. So what do you think of this phenomenon?
This is really difficult. What do you say? I mean, when I wanted to make a joke, I used to say for many years, whatever I say on China is right and the opposite too. So, that, eliminated at least my liability for what I said. But, and of course, the second stereotype is China is huge, that sort of comes next to it. If I look at the second item you mentioned on the party influence, of course, there are hundreds of companies where there's no relevance, where it doesn't matter, where there is either no party organization or it doesn't do any harm or it's even helpful. You have that all, But for me as a lawyer, it's also quite a lot about the potential. Is there a potential for interference at critical times in difficult situations? It's not what happens today, It sort of doesn't open the path for something when the political wind is such that the decision-making should be influenced. We don't have the free decision-making. That's sort of my worry. And maybe we have contradictory statements, not only because China is huge, because sometimes the situation is only created for the potential that something goes in one way, and we don't know before. And the first one was, as an example, private economy or not. I also really don't know where the wind is blowing. I have no idea, but that's pretty bad as a lawyer, right? And I have many companies who come in and say, if I have the choice between a state-owned partner and the private company partner for my next joint venture, what would you say? I really have no answer, I have the answer: a state-owned is closer to the state. That has its disadvantages and its advantages. A private company might be private, might be not. I don't have the answer either. So, I don't know. A wonderful question.
And,
Yeah.
and,
Online?
sorry, and 5 years ago or 10 years ago, would you have had a clearer or cleaner answer to that same question?
Probably yes.
Mm.
Because I would have had a clearer view what's private and what is not private. And I could have made a clearer choice of saying, do you need the state in your project? Are you critical infrastructure? Are you in a critical market segment where it's much better to have the state helping you? Or are you freewheeling new economy, super innovative, where you better don't have anybody looking what you're doing? So, it would have been more clear cut.
Okay, Jessica.
Yeah, so we have about 4 questions. I'll just read the first one for now. It's from Wenyi He. It seems that since Chairman Xi secured his position at the party congress in October, Chinese officials have become more conciliatory to Western business. It seemed Liu He, right? Liu He was trying to be conciliatory at the World Economic Forum, for instance. And they have made more conciliatory noises with Australia over iron and coal imports. Do you think this is a medium or long-term trend or just short-term maneuvering?
Yeah, that is the billion-dollar question, right? We all don't know. I think we had it when Xi Jinping came to power, that we had people who said, or experts who said, he's both a strong ideologist and a reformer. And then a few years down the road, we said, oh, we can't see the reformer anymore. Got lost, where is it? And I see exactly that same discussion coming up now. Maybe now, after 10 years, maybe it's time to see the reformer. I'm the last person to have any background information on how to judge that. I can only tell you, what the likely questions are, but definitely no answer on this one.
Give us another.
Okay. This one is from Teresa Fallon. At Davos, we could see great tensions between the US and European officials in regard to the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. Is your impression that this is part of a bigger strategic autonomy narrative in Europe, or a form of anti-Americanism when European leaders realize that they are rather dependent on the US for their security?
Intra-EU intrigue.
I took it all for free, right? No $1 million question, maybe I get the $1 million. Okay, let me see that. I think just my super personal opinion, that for the last few months or years, or you could see that Europeans really got back closer to the US than the opposite. I think that was in the context of the Russian war against Ukraine. That we could see that even when we were sort of a bit frustrated about some American politics or business decisions or whatever, this had changed the page a bit, that we are far closer, which even now leads to the strong discussion in the media of why we are not delivering more weapons to the Ukraine, but waiting for the US. So that is a sign that we had for the last few years more emphasized the dependency on the security than before. But on the business side and the new law the Americans put out, I forgot the abbreviation, what do you say? The what's it called? IRA.
IRA.
Investment reduction.
Act, it's the IRA, right, it's the IRA. I think these are genuine concerns, but because we still have this crazy DNA of a free market economy, right? So we are just worried that we will not be able to participate in the American markets as before. I mean, that's just a big worry. And we have to work through what the act says and what the implementation is. I think that doesn't really alienate us, but in the whole global scenario where we have these interdependencies, wherever we find a new law that really restricts our investment opportunities, we get a bit nervous.
Well, to, a lot of opportunistic overtures from China, of course, that sort of aiming to warn Europe against being too close to the US or being too dependent on the United States. The United States is looking out for its own good. You Europeans should keep in mind that we can make a lot of money together.
Yeah, I think that we are somehow used as Europe, that we are in between, and then we have over the last few years seen China repeatedly saying that we are only acting in a certain way because we are too close to the US, and which I don't think has been true, and on the business and economic policies and business maneuvers. I think we haven't. I think and now with the China strategy in Europe, that's our problem, that we really try to have our own strategy without being the strategic autonomy, without focusing that too much, and at the same time being a reliable player. So that's really difficult for us, because the Chinese are pushing us in that corner, and when you get pushed in a corner, it's not good either. So and also either they are pushing us in that corner or they are emphasizing, like the new ambassadors now, that we should come out of that corner and be more open-minded, and we just have to keep calm and continue with our policies the way we assess it.
Okay. So what we haven't talked, amazingly, actually, we haven't talked a lot about the war in Ukraine, and the impact that is having on Europe-China relations broadly, of course, geopolitically, but also from the business side, because it has exacerbated a lot of these tensions. The sanctions, for example, just looking at the dramatic reach of the sanctions that the United States has led, and a lot of European countries have followed against Russia, has made everybody aware that if sanctions were going to be leveled against China over some action against Taiwan, that it could be equally far-reaching and draconian. So aside from one knock-on effect you've mentioned, which is German companies thinking about how to structure their China operations to sort of give them some kind of safe harbor, what else is happening as a knock-on effect of this ongoing war and China's anomalous position?
I think what the German companies experienced in Russia was novel to them. Whenever I look at you, I mean naivety, right? So what I think that, before the Russian war, we have sort of been naive on the global interconnectivity. And Russia showed us how we have to be prepared to deal with our dependencies. And the German companies, most of them withdraw rather quickly, and others took until last week. And so I think that was an eye-opener. That was a wake-up call that we have to look at our dependencies. And now we can say China is not Russia, of course. China is not Russia. And dependency are different. Yeah, maybe they are even stronger. in some areas, yeah. But all the discussion about China is not Russia, doesn't help us, because we had the eye-opener and the awakening how geopolitics can affect my individual investment in a major country. That we just didn't have on the radar in that scale. Maybe with some currency issues in South America where we had that in the past, when we didn't get the money or others, but we didn't really have the major dependency on like key business on the agenda. And that's when it was reassessed and started to be reassessed for China. And no matter which scenario, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's something else, totally unpredictable, we don't know yet. Probably the most unpredictable ones are the most risky ones. So that's not the point what triggered it. What will trigger it in China? The point is that the idea that this can happen made the company start to have different discussions in the boardroom.
So this is also from Teresa Fallon. How do you understand Chancellor Scholz's race to Beijing and how he did not want Macron or an EU official to join him?
I couldn't understand the first part of the section. How do you understand Mr. Scholz's visit to Beijing?
How do you understand Chancellor Scholz's race to Beijing and how he did not want Macron or an EU official to join him? What message was Scholz trying to send?
Starting from the back, what I really regretted about his visit was that he did not Europeanize it. That was probably the only major point of criticism I have. That he did, I don't even talk about Macron, these, it could be anybody. And I personally would have picked small countries, real small countries who otherwise don't get the FaceTime. And who are, I would have even picked Litauen, but Lithuania, but that has a totally different connotation, as some of you might know. I would have picked a small country, if not one or two. I would have picked a couple of business people from Europe in my business delegation, and not only the 10 CEOs from the German company. So that is my very personal idea of a coherent European China response, put it that way. Other than that, whether a chancellor travels to China or not, I think, it's one of the biggest countries, and he was in office already for a few months, and it was time to go. So that will be the next step I can easily adhere to, not saying he should not go to China. I mean, I still believe in talking to each other at one point, right? The next criticism is whether he took, why he took only the 10 biggest German CEOs. That might be another criticism. If there are only 10 slots left, pragmatism shows that it's really difficult to get 8 KMOs and only 2 CEOs of big companies. So I leave that aside, right? But in principle, I would say that wasn't a bad choice. But then what message did he want to convey? I think a lot of it was, besides the business, a lot was politics. He was trying to see China in its position in the Russian war on Ukraine. So I wouldn't criticize too much the element on the business side, which wasn't the key message he wanted to send. But the European element was missing.
Well, one of the critiques that I think even inside Germany was made by some was that he shouldn't have brought business, because if he wanted to pressure China to play a more responsible role via Moscow in the Ukraine war, bringing business was a way of saying, well, we'll talk about those rights and legality things, but separately, what we're really here for is to do some business.
Yeah, that's one way you can put it. That's true. You can also try to separate it clearly. And again, for the good or for the bad, the dependencies of German businesses on China is probably bigger than other countries. And so you have to factor it in one way or the other. That was one way. You could have done it the other way. But that's probably why that criticism came up.
Could we just dissect a minute the dependencies of German companies on China? Because what form do those dependencies take? When I look at it's not export to China, because German exports to China aren't really proportionally bigger than other European countries' exports to China. It's still around 10%. So China is a very small export market for Europe relative to even Taiwan, apparently. There's more exports from Europe to Taiwan than to China. So what is the nature of
I
this?
think it's the investment.
Mhm.
Is that the companies have huge investments in China,
Mhm.
huge in comparison to their other worldwide activities. So when you compare the exports to other exports, they're small, but if you compare the investments, they're huge compared to other locations' investments. And so these investments means a dependency, which is more than just the money going out to build a factory. It's a lot of technological back and forth. And it's a lot of supply chain and customers. And as I always learn from the European Chamber of Commerce, they tell me it's still the innovative driver.
Mm.
That they say without China, they wouldn't have the innovative jumps they are making back home.
Because of
And that's
engineers?
because of the re-engineering or the engineering or the Chinese themselves is a huge market. They can test the driverless car for tens and tens of thousands of miles, and we won't even find a highway even in Germany with 10 kilometers where they could test it, That's sort of the innovation jump they have. So it's surprising that the companies themselves say how much they're dependent on China when it comes to innovation.
Mm.
And that's the answer.
Yeah, you mentioned George Woodgate before,
Mhm.
the head of the
EU Chamber of Commerce
yeah,
in China.
EU Chamber of Commerce in China. He's very outspoken, or I mean, maybe outspoken isn't the right word. He speaks a lot. Shall I say. He talked quite a bit.
I speak a lot too, and I'm not that famous. Talk a lot.
He gives talks, he writes papers,
Yeah.
he has meetings, he's on social media all the time. And I think for a lot of non-Europeans, such as myself, he is the voice of European business. Yet, and he's been in the last few years, particularly during COVID, quite critical of the Chinese government policies, was very critical of zero COVID. But the interesting thing to me is that his company, BASF, the huge chemical company, has just been putting a new greenfield facility in Guangzhou province in the south, and has been one of the leaders in new investments in China. And so I don't know which voice I should be paying attention to, the investment voice or what he says on social media.
BASF put in a $10 billion project as a wholly owned foreign company, so it's not a joint venture. That was one of the key successes in doing that.
Mm.
And so he has two heads. I'm not speaking for him. He should answer that question himself much better. But from what I know, I would say when he's speaking for the European companies in China, he speaks for the European companies in China. And he makes a very, very clear distinction, and we should not mix the two. And when he speaks for the European companies in China, he does it on the basis of the information brought to him by the European companies. And I think we should be more than happy that we have someone who doesn't speak indirectly for his company, but who manages to have a clear separation on when he talks for whom. And I think the input he gets as a European Chamber of Commerce is really representing then also the opinion of the European companies. And he has been very, whatever we call it, talking a lot or outspoken or critical or whatever you want to talk it, he talks. And but always with the twist, we learned, all of us learned that it has to have an element that shows your counterpart that you're taking it serious and even making proposals. He was all quite far out there, all making proposals what he would change and not just saying this is wrong and that is wrong. And that's the key thing. And that's why he was expected and respected and can do what he said, because he never went out playing criticism.
So to what extent is a company like BASF forced to make these major investments in China, chemical company, because Germany's own environmental regulations make it impossible to build that company back home, to build that factory, that facility back home?
I don't think that holds true, what you're saying. I think it's not built there because it cannot be built back home. It's built for the Chinese market. I mean, I'm not a BASF person, but as far as I know, this is a project which is purely for the Chinese market. And would not, never ever be in another place. On the environmental standards, again, as indirect information as I have, the environmental standards in Germany for a factory like the ones they're having are very high. And the new project in China is trying to introduce as much as they can on new environmental issues. They're also trying to have only clean energy under certain projects, which I can't describe because I can't really do that. But it's not that the environmental standard in any way affected the business decision, because that's what the chemical industry in 2023 cannot afford anymore to play that. But it is a standalone project. It's a project meant for the Chinese market. That's a key point.
So I haven't heard anything about European companies' reactions to the Chinese Belt and Road, Chinese relationships in African countries. And I'm curious if you have a view vis-a-vis either the Belt and Road or Africa, whether you continue to put it in partner, competitor, systemic rival. So can you say a bit about interest, Africa, Belt and Road, vis-a-vis business and China?
First thing, I mean, tears, Professor Alvarez, that you have never heard of anything coming out from Europe, because we have this huge initiative to counter the Belt and Road, which we call Global Gateway. And it's such a pity. No, I mean, it's not your fault, it's our fault, because Global Gateway never got traction in the media. It never got traction in real life. I'm searching for words. Yeah, it's still at its infant state, but it was the thing, you know, we had this idea, we really thought we have to do that. We have to not deal with our colonial past and be always told that we only want regime change and this, we only get money if you do a regime change, but we really wanted to have something very innovative on an economic business model. And so we have this global gateway, and it's just Europe. Sometimes it's just difficult. We are quite many, you know, many small countries, many small countries. And I hope we get it started somehow. Because on the other side, you know, in those countries where China does Belt and Road projects, I'm not a statistics guy, but in those countries, there is a lot of European funding already. But we also never got it to tell the world, hey, we are doing at least as much as China in country XYZ. We never got that. We never got the narrative right. China is much, much better in getting the narrative. We don't get the narrative right where we are doing something, and when we are doing something like the Global Gateway, we don't really get the act together that easily. And so Brussels will have to do something about that. So that's, you know, because of course we think that a lot in those projects is all about the rule of law and standards and all what can we do to help out.
I want to quickly ask a question about Lithuania, which you mentioned in passing.
In passing, yeah.
So for those who may not know, the EU has brought a WTO claim against China with respect to its de facto economic punishment of Lithuania for having opened a high-level office in Tibet. So what does the current status of Chinese actions against Lithuanian products stand? I mean, I had read early on that this was affecting a lot of actual German products because they had Lithuanian components. Is that correct?
Does the audience know the Lithuania case, or shall we summarize it quickly? Lithuania did not open an office in Taiwan, but it admitted that Taiwan opens a so-called Taiwan representative office in Lithuania. The name, it's a question of the name. It should have been Taipei representative, but Lithuania allowed Taiwan representative office. And then China retaliated in a way which, that's why I try to re-explain the case, because for lawyers, it's just tremendously interesting what happened, you know. China reacted by deleting Lithuania from the world map. And I put it in my words, you know, now you know me after more than an hour, you know, it can deal with my way to talk. But what it did is when ships came from Lithuania, the guys at the harbor at customs said, Lithuania doesn't exist. It was deleted from the customs list. So for a lawyer, I think this is it's just incredible. Imagine they come to see you and ask, what can we do? Okay, so that's just what they did in the first place. And then when the EU ambassadors luckily en group, protested. They were told, no, this didn't happen, and the list was back there the next day, but it was gone again a few days later. So that was the first kind of retaliation, which is fun for lawyers, but not fun for real life. And the second one was the most serious one. It's the one you mentioned in ways of sanctions, that whatever companies have products from Lithuania in their products cannot export those products to China. And I think Lithuania has a lot of software. I don't know what kind of hardware is there. And there were some German companies who had who have a lot of Lithuanian business dealings, and so they were indirectly affected, or directly, so to speak, indirectly by the Lithuania problem, but directly by the sanctions. And that for me is really one of the big cases. How to deal with China, what do we do? What was the big mistake? The big mistake under quotation mark, was a political issue. And then we have this immediate reaction for German companies exporting a product to China, and the German companies really haven't done anything wrong. So for me, Lithuania is the key point when I'm in any government discussions on how to deal with China. I say we can predict anything, we can write lists on tools and what we have, but are we ready to react to Lithuania 2.0? That is the outgoing question. We still have a few minutes, but that would be the final thing for me. Are we all prepared for Lithuania 2.0? Because I think this is the new world of sanctions and actions, and which we lawyers really have difficulties to break down and work on when it runs into these political tensions as well.
Did China ever?
But to answer your question, I don't know where we stand, because it became suddenly very silent. Does anybody know where we stand? Anybody in the audience, please write a little note to us.
Okay, the claim was filed, but then.
The claim was filed, but I mean in
terms of
the claim, of course, we know it's only
trade,
filed, but the actual trade, that's your
Yeah, the
question.
actual
That's what we don't know.
trade,
The actual trade and the actual sanctions.
Yeah. Did China ever acknowledge that it was doing this and then base it on its anti-sanctions
I know what you mean. Did
it ever base it on any Chinese law? Because initially
legalize it, so to speak, in a way? Did it refer to any legal provision, or was it the I would even dare to say usual intransparent approach?
Yeah.
I don't know. But when you look at the sanctions we talked about earlier, the sanction in the context of Kai and these sort of two-side sanctions, the Chinese sanctions were, at least to my knowledge, never formally established. They were established through the media.
Okay, that was also
But acknowledged.
that was my
But we have no legal
understanding
thing
as
we
well.
could fight.
There was no.
So I don't know about Lithuania. I don't know.
So we have 2 more questions. One of them is really short. It's from Mimi Joe. Can we have a more nuanced distinction between different SOEs?
Mimi, the shortest questions are always the most difficult ones. I was already scared when you said it's a short question. But she meant it politically in a way, do we have good SOEs and bad SOEs? Or more political and less political SOEs? I really don't know. I know that when I'm asked as a lawyer to comment on SOEs, I have a real difficulty when a company is an SOE. On percentage wise, how much percentage of the state, how indirect participation is, and what we do our home. But if once I start chatting, I go on. Like if you say we have the German investment screening of foreign investment, and you have a Chinese company that goes through a Hong Kong company, and 5 or 6 intermediate companies in between, I think it will always be a really tough choice to know whether a Chinese company investing in Europe is an SOE or not, or is an indirect SOE, or is state-sponsored in a way. So I put that on a pragmatic level. That's already where it starts, is on investment screening in Europe, that we don't really know what the entity is we have in front of us. And the other one, you said there was one more?
Yeah, doing great. Okay. So this is from, I'm sorry if I pronounced the name wrong. Shahib Merakar. They said, thank you for the insightful topic that you raised. My question is, are there any possibilities to promote mediation for an amicable solution instead of enforcing policies, whereas there are countries that could act neutrally that are able to mediate on specific case-to-case basis to avoid further disruption to the world economics as well as peace.
It's challenging your
Yeah.
arbitration focus.
Thank you, Professor. I needed somehow to bridge over to an answer. Yeah, I don't really know. Mediation will always be the preferred way. It's just a question, are both sides ready to talk? I mean, we have seen a reluctance on the Chinese side to continue with all these dialogue formats we had over the last decades developed to get them up and going again. And that's the first thing we hope, that at least we get the dialogue going back now that the pandemic situation improved. But whether mediation is only a solution for a single case. And that sometimes is worrying if you solve one single case, but don't solve the underlying differences you have. That would be the abstract answer to that.
And the results of the mediation are usually not public either, so others don't necessarily
Yeah,
benefit.
that's a good point.
But, you
I
know,
think that the dear colleague back there, he raised his hand about 15 times.
Oh,
and
sorry.
We never paid attention.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You get
do
the,
that.
the last word.
You'll ask us about Lithuania, Catherine said that much better than I could. Let me ask a quick question about Kai. I don't understand what the political strategy was for management of Kai in the European Parliament. I don't understand how they thought it would land, and I wondered whether it had been mothballed before it could be destroyed. Do you know how people thought the Kai would have been managed within the European Parliament, even without the sanctions regime or the wider Xinjiang issues that came up?
I think at that time it would have gone through.
Okay.
I think so. I mean, it was 7 years in the making. So when it started, I think there was some optimism that makes sense. When it was finished and I saw the latest draft, it was quite heavily defended by Brussels, what is in there, even at that time already when there wasn't too much in there. I think it would have gone through. So it could, that was pretty quick when it went through the deep freezer, or as you say, mothballing, we call it deep freezer. And that was quick. And wouldn't have happened then. I think probably this chance was 60–70% that it went through rather smoothly. Yep.
I apologize for overlooking your. Apropos of the question about mediation, in the spring, is this not usually the time for the China-EU summit? Last April, there was a China-EU summit, and not much was accomplished. It was virtual, I believe. Not much was accomplished. There's no discussion yet of.
I don't know. I'm not an insider on the. No, but I remember there was a very harsh wording that time.
Yes.
That which actually Catherine is kind of picking up on the question of mediation and dialogue.
Yes.
Because at that time it wasn't called even a dialogue.
Yeah, that would be the next opportunity
Yeah,
for a larger.
Or something like a
kind of a
Yeah,
dialogue, exactly.
exactly.
That at that time, it was, of course, in the shadow of the very recent Russian action in
Right.
Ukraine, and there was still quite a bit of anger against China for its statements about its, lasting, no hard holds barred friendship with Russia. For some reason, that seems to have faded quite a bit. China's moved back into its more typical sort of anomalous, this doesn't really affect us type position, even while it continues to have military drills with Russia. So
Yeah. That's what we call Russian neutrality, if they have. Yeah.
well, I think we have to leave it there. We're at time. Thank you everyone for your great questions.
I have to finish my sentence from the very beginning. Because that's
right.
Yeah, because that idea came only up while I was talking, that I said, yeah, but I said, if you say that EU-China can resume business as usual, you're a pessimist.
Yes.
And not the other way around. And I said that because if you think so, then you miss out on the changes that occurred. And if you're if you think that business can be exactly like in 2012 again, then you don't get how much changed of those 10 years. And if you don't get the changes, then, I'm not hopeful for your business, and that's why I would be a pessimist. But the other way means, if it's not business as usual, we can sort of be optimists that we are clear-eyed and know what the problem is, and that we have to do our homework, how we can better deal with the change China.
You are more likely to have a successful.
Then you're more
venture in
likely to
China.
have a successful venture in China. That is why I wanted to conclude as an optimist.
So this is the advice that you give to your clients,
Yeah.
pay attention
Yes.
and
Accept the world as it is. Yeah.
excellent closing words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine.